March 15, 1945, the Sland 0430 hours, ob Stilhelm Richtor pressed himself deeper into the muddy crater as another round of American artillery shells whistled overhead. For 3 weeks now, his worn-out infantry regiment had held this part of the Oise line against Patton's Third Army, and he thought he had seen everything the Americans could throw at them. The usual pattern was predictable: heavy artillery first, then fighter-bomber attacks at dawn, and then Sherman tanks rolling forward with infantry support. His men knew how to handle it. They had handled it since Normandy. But this morning felt different. The American guns had gone silent 10 minutes ago, too early for their usual schedule. In the darkness, Richtor could hear tank engines, lots of them, but they seemed to be holding position instead of moving forward. Then he heard something else, a metallic clanking, like someone putting up scaffolding, but it echoed across multiple points along the American line. Feldwebel-Klaus Hoffmann crawled into the crater beside him, his face pale in the pre-dawn darkness. "Sir, the forward observation post reports strange activity. The Americans are bringing up trucks, ordinary trucks, but they are doing something to them. The observers can't make out what in this light." Trucks. Richtor almost laughed. After everything, the Americans were bringing up supply trucks to the front line. Maybe they were more desperate than he had thought. He raised his field glasses, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. What he saw next would haunt him for the rest of his life. The first rocket launched at 0445, a streak of fire that lit up the whole valley. Then another and another. Within seconds, 60 rockets were screaming through the air. They're banshee-like. Wail was unlike anything the German defenders had ever heard. The rockets weren't coming from regular artillery positions. They seemed to be coming from what looked like ordinary Sherman tanks, with massive tube arrays mounted on top. "Mein Gott," Hoffmann gasped. "What is that thing?" Before Richtor could answer, the rockets hit. The entire German defensive line exploded in fire and smoke. Unlike normal artillery that came in waves, this was instant saturation, 60 high-explosive warheads exploding within seconds of each other, turning carefully prepared positions into chaos. Men who had survived 3 years on the Eastern Front, who had endured the massive Soviet artillery barges, stood frozen by this new horror. The screaming of the rockets was the worst part. Gerrit Hans Müller, 19 years old, would later write in his diary if he survived this morning. It was not like artillery or mortars. It was like the devil himself was screaming at us. The sound went right through. You made your bones shake, and it came from trucks. Regular American trucks. The Wehrmacht had its own rocket artillery. Of course, the Nablier had served on every front. Since 1941, German soldiers called them Stucker zu Fuß, Stucker on foot, for the terrifying sound they made, but the Nablier was a special weapon needing trained crews, special ammunition, and careful positioning. Each launcher had 6 tubes and took 90 seconds to reload. They were moved into position, set up, fired, and quickly moved, before Allied counterfire could find them. It was precise German engineering. At its best, what the Americans did was impossible for the German army to understand. They had taken normal vehicles, Sherman tanks, regular army trucks, and just put rocket launchers on them. No special chassis, no years of work, just simple brute force. A Sherman tank that could fight like a normal tank and then fire 60 rockets in 10 seconds when needed. Trucks that could carry supplies one day and deadly firepower the next. Major Friedrich Kohler, commanding what was left of an artillery battalion, watched through his rangefinder as 3 more Sherman tanks with rocket launchers moved into position. He had been an artillery officer for 7 years, trained at the best military schools in Germany. What he was seeing broke all his ideas about weapons. They must be desperate. He told his assistant, strapping rockets to tanks like some trick. It cannot be accurate, it cannot be reliable, but it was reliable. Terrifyingly reliable, and the Americans seemed to have endless supply of them. As the sun rose on March 15th, Kola counted at least 12 of these rocket-launching Shermans, which the Americans called calliope for the musical instrument they looked like. But there were also trucks, normal 2.5-ton trucks fitted with arrays of rocket tubes firing 36 rockets at a time. The psychological effect was immediate and deadly. On to his Erich Braun, a veteran of Stalingrad and Kursk, found his hands shaking as he tried to rally his men. He had faced the Soviet Katyushas, Stalin's organs as they called them, but this was different. The Soviets had special rocket trucks. Everyone knew you could see them coming and prepare yourself mentally. But when any American vehicle could suddenly fire rocket, hell nowhere felt safe. The Americans are crazy. Braun wrote to his wife, though the letter would never be sent. They put rockets on everything. Yesterday, I saw rockets fired from a normal supply truck. Today, from tanks that look like they have organ pipes growing from their turrets. They must have so much production. They can afford to experiment like children with toys. We saved every shell, every rocket. They turned their vehicles into carnival attractions that spit death. What the Germans did not know was that the American rocket program was a product of their huge industrial power, but also their special skill at practical improvisation. The T-34 Calliope had been developed in 1943, but the Army at first was unsure, too heavy. Some generals said too easy. To hit by enemy fire, others argued, the rocket tubes blocked the tank gun when lifted. But American commanders in the field did not care about rules. They cared about what worked. If putting 60 rocket tubes on a Sherman tank gave them instant, deadly firepower, that is what they did. The rockets themselves were simple 4.5-inch M8 models. Nothing new in their design, but mounted in huge numbers on moving vehicles and fired in big salvos. They made a shock that even smart German weapons could not match. Lieutenant James Patterson, a tank officer with the 12th Armored Division, would later describe the German reaction to their first Calliope barrage. You could see them just freeze. These were hardened Wehrmacht troops, and they just stood there, stunned. The sound was incredible, like 1,000 banshees all screaming at once. But I think what really got them was seeing it come from what looked like a regular Sherman. They could not process it. The German military education system, the finest in the world, taught careful development and use of special weapons. Every piece of equipment had a specific role, clearly defined and doctrinally pure. The Panzer IV was a tank. The Nebelwerfer was rocket artillery. The Sturmgeschütz was an assault gun. Each had its place in the carefully planned ballet of combined arms warfare, but the Americans just stuck rockets on whatever moved. By March 1945, they were putting rocket launchers on jeeps, half-tracks, landing craft. Anything. With wheels or tracks, the Marines in the Pacific had done this since 1943, bolting rocket racks on 1-ton trucks and turning them into mobile terror weapons. It was crude and ugly and hugely effective. General Major Hans von Kleist, watching the American advance from his divisional command post, could not hide his shock from his staff. "This is not warfare as we know it," he said. "This is industrial brutality. They do not build weapon systems. They mass-produce parts and snap them together, like building blocks. A tank becomes rocket artillery. A truck becomes a missile launcher. Tomorrow, they will put rockets on their field." Kitchens, his aide, Hedman Werner Schultz, tried to keep proper military bearing, but even he was shaken. "Herr General, our intelligence reports. They are making these rocket vehicles in huge numbers, not in special factories, just in normal tank depots, adding the rocket systems like accessories. Von Kleist's mouth tightened when we made the Nebelwerfer. It took 3 years of study, special factories, and trained crews who knew the ballistics and the propellant. These Americans probably decided at lunch and had the first units ready by dinner. He was not far wrong. The Colopy system could be put on a standard. Sherman in a few hours, and when not needed, the rocket launcher could be removed, and the tank sent back to normal fighting. It was American pragmatism at its most brutal. Why spend years making the perfect rocket artillery vehicle when you can bolt rockets onto existing tanks and get battlefield power right away? The rockets kept coming all morning. Gerrit Müller, still alive in his broken bunker, tried to count the salvos. His squad leader, a veteran of 5 years of combat, had given up trying to keep any control. The men huddled in whatever cover they could find and flinched with each screaming barrage. How many rockets can they possibly have? Someone asked in the dark of the bunker. All of them, the squad leader answered sadly. They have all the rockets. The American logistics system so big, the German mind could not understand, could send thousands of rockets to the front every day. While German units carefully saved their Nebelwerfer ammo, sometimes only enough for 1 or 2 salvos. A day American rocket units fired without care. A single Colopy could fire 60 rockets, reload in under 10 minutes, and do it again and again and again. Obstilhelm Richtor, still alive, but with his regiment no longer able to fight, tried to report. To division headquarters. The field telephone lines were cut, so he sent a runner. The message was short and terrible. Enemy using new rocket weapon in huge numbers mounted on standard vehicles. Psychological effect on troops. Severe, cannot hold. The runner Oberrichter Paul Zimmermann reached Division HQ but found chaos there too. American rocket-equipped tanks had broken through at many points. Staff officers who had served since Poland fumbled with maps, trying to make sense of reports. That seemed impossible. Rocket-firing Sherman's truck-mounted missile systems, even jeeps with rocket tubes. This must be a mistake. The operations officer said the Americans do not have that many special rocket vehicles our intelligence would have. Known, but intelligence had failed them. The American skill to quickly produce and change weapons had made a gap. German doctrine could not explain. While the Wehrmacht spent years making perfect weapons, the Americans spent months mass-producing. Good enough solutions that worked in battle and supplies kept flowing day and night, helping them overwhelm defenses quickly. The T-34 Colopy was a perfect example. Was it as accurate as German artillery? No. Was it as sophisticated as the Nebelwerfer? No, but when 60 rockets landed in your position within 10 seconds, accuracy did not matter. The shock and fear were worth more than precision. Feldwebel Hoffmann separated from Obstilhelm Richtor. In the chaos found himself with a mixed group of survivors from different units. They had taken shelter in a destroyed farmhouse, trying to understand what had happened to their carefully prepared defensive line. An older soldier, a Stabs Gap fighter from a pioneer battalion, spoke almost calmly. About his shock, I helped design the Atlantic Wall fortifications. I calculated exactly how much concrete was needed to stop naval bombardment and the precise angles for machine gun fields of fire. Everything measured to the millimeter, and the Americans just covered everything with rockets from trucks. From trucks, the younger soldiers were even more shaken. They had been told many times about German technical superiority, about the V-2 rockets that terrorized London, about jet fighters and super tanks. But here were the Americans turning their regular vehicles into rocket launchers like it was nothing special. One private, barely 18, asked the question. They all thought, if they can do this with trucks, what else can they do? No one answered. The thought was too frightening. By noon on March 15, the German defensive line had mostly stopped being a line. Not destroyed in the usual way, but broken in the minds of the men. Units that had held against everything the Allies threw at them fell. Apart when faced with screaming rocket salvos from what looked like ordinary vehicles, the American advance moved so fast they captured many German command posts still standing, including General Vaughn's divisional headquarters. The intelligence officer, Major Thompson, was excited about the German maps and plans. "Look at this," he told Captain Martinez. "They have detailed fire plans for their Nebelwerfers, precise calculations, best places to put them. Even weather details for propellant burn rates. They turned rocket artillery into a science." Martinez laughed. "And we just bolted a bunch of tubes to a Sherman and called it a day." Thompson replied, suddenly serious. "That's the difference. They make perfect weapons. We mass-produce solutions." Among the captured papers was a personal diary belonging to Hedman, Schultz von Kleist's aide. His last entry written that morning was clear. The Americans have broken the rules of war, not by better tech, but by having no rules at all. They put rockets on tanks like a child ties fireworks to a wagon. It should look silly. Instead, it is terrifying. We perfect the art of war. They mass-produce the tools of victory. The few German units that managed to pull back in order carried stories that sounded impossible. To rear area commanders, rockets from tanks, rockets from trucks. Hundreds of them, thousands, fired with a carelessness that suggested endless supplies. A staff colonel at Army Group GHQ first refused to accept the reports. Propaganda, he said, panicked. Troops exaggerating. The Americans cannot have so many of these weapons. But then more reports came from different places, all saying the same thing. The Americans had turned rocket artillery from a special weapon into a common ability. Any vehicle could become a rocket launcher. Any unit could deliver huge, deadly firepower. The colonel finally faced the truth when a recon photo arrived showing a column of Sherman's half with the clear Calliope rocket racks moving toward the German lines. He stared at the picture for a long time, then quietly said, "We have lost." His aide was shocked. "Sir, one weapon system cannot do this." The aide protested. "It's not only the weapon." The colonel cut in. "It's what it shows. We spend years making the perfect weapon. They spend weeks fitting old weapons together in new ways. We have skilled makers. They have factories. We have rigid rules. They have abundance." The shock and fear spread through the Wehrmacht like a sickness. Soldiers who kept their will to fight through 5 years of war began to doubt. If the Americans can easily turn any vehicle into a deadly rocket platform, what is the point of fighting on letters home? Censored but still showing the shock revealed. How deep it was. "My dear wife," one sergeant wrote, "the Americans fight war like they make cars. They take a standard model and add options. Today, rockets tomorrow. Who knows? We cannot compete with this. It is not real warfare. It is mass production of death." Another soldier, writing to his mother, was even more direct. "They say our weapons are better, but better than what the Americans do not even treat weapons as special. They bolt rockets to trucks like farmers adding plows. How do you fight an enemy that treats deadly firepower as casual?" Modification. The Calliope and its truck-mounted cousins were not miracle weapons in the usual sense. They were not accurate compared to tube artillery. The rockets had spread patterns that horrified German artillery officers trained in precise fire. The whole system was unstable. The Calliope made the Sherman top heavy, hard to move, and the rocket tubes blocked the main gun when lifted. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that America could make them in huge numbers, put them into use instantly, and fire them without worry about ammo. It was the clear sign of American industrial power, crude, huge, and unstoppable. By late March 1945, the mental damage was complete. German units that had fought hard for years began surrendering at the first sound of rocket salvos. The screaming of the Calliope had become the sound of certain defeat. General Lieutenant Otto Heydrich, commanding a corps on the island, wrote in his war diary, "The enemy has achieved moral superiority through material abundance. Our soldiers no longer fight the Americans. They fight the idea of America. Every rocket salvo reminds them that we are a small nation, fighting the industrial output of a whole continent. The rockets themselves do less damage than normal. Artillery, but they destroy something. Artillery cannot touch hope." The truth was that the Calliope was not even very successful by American standards. Only about 200 were ever made, far less than first planned. The weapon had big problems that stopped it from being used everywhere. Many tank crews wanted to keep their Shermans as normal tanks rather than deal with the rocket system, but the Germans did not know this. To them, every Calliope sighting meant thousands more. Every truck mounted. Rocket Array suggested an endless production line of similar weapons. They could not believe the Americans would make such weapons in small numbers. In German experience, if you built a new weapon system, you committed to it fully. The American way was experimental and changing, sometimes dropped as quickly as adopted, and that confused them. The Calliope was just one of dozens of rocket launcher types. The Americans tried T-40 whiz-bang with larger rockets, T-76 with shorter tubes, M-17 on half-tracks. Some worked and some did not, but all were tried because America could afford to test many ideas. A captured German intelligence report from April 1945 showed how badly they misunderstood. Enemy rocket artillery looks unlimited, conservative estimates. Said thousands of rocket vehicles, production capacity must be huge. Recommend study of American factories for after the war. The truth was, American rocket vehicle production was small by American standards. But when you can build 20,000, Shermans adding rocket launchers to a few hundred is nothing. When your truck output is in the hundreds of thousands, converting some to rocket launchers is barely a note in production reports. Onisia Braun, who survived the March 15th barrage, was captured a week later. During questioning, his American captors were surprised by his questions. He did not ask about his fate or prisoner treatment. He asked about the rockets. How many factories make those rocket tanks? The interrogator, Lieutenant David Cohen, looked confused. Factories? You mean depots? We just add rocket launchers at maintenance depots. Brun stared. Maintenance depots? You mean no special factories? Cohen shrugged. Why need them? It is some tubes and an electrical firing system. Any good mechanic can install it. Braun went pale. Any good mechanic. The Americans treated weapons that would have taken years of German work as an afternoon project. The conversation went on with Braun getting more upset as he learned about American production. The rockets were simple, 4.5-inch models mass-produced in factories that had once made everything from refrigerators to car parts. The launchers were welded from normal steel tubing. The electrical firing systems came from existing tank equipment. You must understand, Braun finally said, His English slow but clear. In Germany, a weapon like this would be a national project, special development bureau, special factories, years of testing. You do this, like adding a radio to a car. Cohen nodded. Pretty much. If it works, we make more. If it does not, we try something else. Try something else. The casual ignoring of failed experiments, and the willingness to drop things that did not work, and the wealth that allowed this kind of waste, was everything the resource-starved Wehrmacht could never have. As March turned to April 1945, the rocket vehicles became a symbol of American abundance more than just their military power. German soldiers began surrendering to any American unit, sure that resistance was useless against an enemy that could so casually use these weapons. A Wehrmacht chaplain, Father Andreas Müller, wrote in his journal, "The men no longer talk of tactics or strategy. They talk only of American rockets and trucks and endless supplies. They have seen the future, and it is made in Detroit." The mention of Detroit was clear. The Germans learned many vehicles came from the same factories that had made civilian cars. The idea that car factories could make military vehicles was not shocking, but the speed and scale of it was, and the easy addition of weapons to these vehicles, as if rockets were just another option, like heating or better suspension, showed a way of war German tradition could not understand. Private Kurt Wagner, 19 years old, captured in early April, told his interrogators a story showing the German mental collapse. His unit had been holding a crossroads, well dug in with anti-tank guns and machine gun nests. They had held similar positions for weeks against normal attacks. Then we heard the sound, Wagner recalled. Screaming, like demons. My sergeant, a veteran of Russia, just dropped his weapon and said, "It's over." We all knew what he meant. If they have so many rockets, they can waste them on a crossroads. They have already won. The crossroads was hit by 3 Calliope salvos, 180 rockets in 30 seconds. The actual casualties were small because the Germans were well dug in, but the mental effect was complete. The whole unit surrendered without firing a shot. By mid-April 1945, American forces were racing through Germany, often facing only token resistance. The rocket vehicles had become legendary, their psychological effect far bigger than their tactical value. German soldiers would run at the sound of any rocket. Convinced American rocket trucks were hunting them when in reality most American units never saw a Calliope or rocket truck. The weapons were rare, hard to use, and often kept for special missions, but the Germans thought they were everywhere. Every Sherman could be a Calliope. Every truck could fire rocket hell. The uncertainty paralyzed them. Colonel William Harrison, commanding an armored battalion, wrote in his report, "The rocket weapons gave a psychological victory far bigger than their real use. We had 3 Calliopes in the whole division, but the Germans thought we had hundreds. Their fear of our industrial power became a weapon stronger than the rockets. The German High Command tried to fight the mental effect with propaganda. Leaflets said American rocket weapons were crude and inaccurate. Technical briefings showed their limits. Orders said, do not talk about enemy material power, but it was too late." The image of Americans casually bolting rockets onto trucks had broken something deep in the German mind. They had always believed that better training doctrine and technology could overcome material weakness. But what technology could beat an enemy that treated deadly weapons as minor modifications? In one of war's ironies, captured German rocket. Scientists were sometimes asked to evaluate American rocket weapons. Their responses were always dismissive from a technical view. The rockets were inefficient, the mounting systems crude, the firing mechanisms simple. But when asked about effectiveness, they admitted the weapons did their job. Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann, a rocket propellant expert, said it clearly. You Americans built a rocket system a graduate student could design, but you built thousands while we were still perfecting the perfect theoretical solution. Your rockets are crude. Our rockets are sophisticated. Your rockets won the war. The last German military communications from the Western Front in April and May 1945 are full of mentions of American rocket weapons. Units reported phantom rocket attacks hearing the screaming of Kalapis that weren't there. The psychological warfare was total. Field Marshal Albert Kessler, commanding German forces in the West, gave a final judgment in late April. The enemy has not beaten us with better strategy or tactics. They have simply overwhelmed us with material abundance. They put rockets on trucks because they can. They fire thousands where we would fire dozens. They have turned war into mass production, and we cannot match the assembly line. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Among the thousands of German prisoners were veterans who had fought the whole war from Poland to the end. When asked what finally broke their will to fight, many said the American rocket. Weapons, not because they were especially deadly, but because of what they showed, Feldwebel. Klaus Hoffmann, who survived that first barrage on March 15th, was processed through a prisoner of war camp in France. During his intake, he was asked about combat. He had fought in Poland, France, Russia, Italy, and finally Germany. He had faced British commandos, Soviet Guards divisions, and American paratroopers. But when asked what weapon he feared most, his answer was instant. The rocket trucks. Not because they killed more than artillery, but because they showed us we had already lost. Any nation that can put rockets on trucks for fun, that can waste them on small targets, that can make them like candy, such a nation cannot be defeated by soldiers. We're fighting factories, not armies. The Calliope would be taken out of service soon after the war. The rocket trucks were turned back into normal transport vehicles. The whole American rocket artillery project of World War II would mostly be forgotten, overshadowed by the atomic bomb and other wonder weapons. But for the Germans who faced them in the last weeks of the war, they stayed a symbol of American industrial power, both crude and huge. The image of rockets bolted onto trucks of Shermans, with organ pipe launchers of every vehicle able to become a deadly weapon, showed something key about the American way of war. Years later, Ostilhelm Richter, who survived that morning on the island, wrote in his memoirs, "We Germans always looked for the perfect weapon. The Americans just wanted enough weapons. We built the V-2 rocket that could hit London from the continent. They put smaller rockets on trucks and won the war." There is a lesson, though I am not sure we have learned it even now. The lesson is simple, but deep. In modern industrial war, quantity has a quality of its own. The ability to mass-produce good enough weapons will always beat the hunt for perfect weapons. The Calliope, crude and clumsy as it was, showed this truth in the clearest way. The screaming of those rockets, the sight of ordinary vehicles turned into terror weapons, the easy abundance of American firepower, all of it together created a mental breaking point for the Wehrmacht. They were not defeated by better strategy or tactics. They were overwhelmed by an enemy that could experiment, waste, and try anything because they had everything. In the end, the Germans could not believe. America turned ordinary trucks into rocket artillery. They showed us we had already lost any nation that can put rockets on trucks for fun, that can waste them on small targets, that can make them like candy. Such a nation cannot be defeated by soldiers. We were fighting factories, not armies. The Calliope would be removed. From service soon after the war, the rocket trucks were changed back to normal transport vehicles. The whole American rocket artillery experiment of World War II would mostly be forgotten, overshadowed by the atomic bomb and other wonder weapons. But for the Germans who faced them in the last weeks of the war, they stayed a symbol of American industrial power, both crude and huge. The image of rockets bolted onto trucks, Shermans with organ pipe launchers, and every vehicle possibly becoming a deadly weapon showed something important about the American way of war. Years later, Ostilhelm Richter, who survived that morning on the island, wrote in his memoirs, "We Germans always wanted the perfect weapon. The Americans just wanted enough weapons. We built the V-2 that could hit London. They put smaller rockets on trucks and won the war." There is a lesson there, though I am not sure we have learned it even now. The lesson was simple, but very deep. In modern industrial warfare, quantity has a quality of its own. The ability to mass-produce good enough solutions will always beat chasing perfect weapons. The Calliope, crude and awkward, showed this truth in the clearest way. The screaming of the rockets, the sight of ordinary vehicles turned into terror weapons, the casual abundance of American firepower altogether created a mental breaking point for the Wehrmacht. They were not defeated by better strategy or tactics. They were overwhelmed by an enemy that could afford to try anything, waste resources and experiment because they had everything. In the end, the Germans could not believe America turned ordinary trucks into rocket artillery. The rocket weapons also destroyed the Wehrmacht's careful tactical rules. German defensive tactics depended on planned responses, careful use of ammunition, and precise fire. Every shell had to count. Every rocket from their Nebelwerfers was precious. But the Americans fired rockets like they were celebrating the 4th of July. Oberleutnant Georg Fischer, a staff officer with what was left of the 116th Panzer Division, tried to understand American tactics. "Our rules say rocket artillery should be hidden for key moments. The Americans use it for everything. Suppressing a machine gun nest, 60 rockets. Clearing a roadblock, 60 rockets. They even fired rockets at the single snipers. It is madness. But madness we cannot fight." The madness had a reason. American commanders learned that huge firepower saved lives. Why send soldiers to clear a place when you could cover it with rockets? The Germans, counting every shell, could not understand such huge numbers. A captured German training manual from March 1945 showed their effort to adapt new section on American rocket vehicles. Enemy uses modified tanks and trucks with many rocket launchers. Weapons are inaccurate, but used in huge numbers. Psychological effect: severe recommend retreat, when rocket vehicles are seen to save forces for better fights. The manual basically admitted defeat. When your rules tell you to run from enemy weapons, the war is already lost. American production numbers revealed after the war showed the real scale of the gap. While Germany made about 6,000 Nebelwerfer launchers in the whole war, American factories could make that many rocket tubes in 1 month. The M8 rocket, the standard American rocket, saw over 2.5 million units made. The Germans could not imagine such numbers. General Alaburst Johannes Blasowitz, one of Germany's top commanders, said in April 1945, "We are not fighting the American army. We are fighting American factories." Every rocket screaming overhead was made by workers who never heard a bomb fall, in factories running 3 shifts using materials from a continent we cannot reach. How does one fight such an enemy? The psychological impact went beyond the front lines. German civilians already hurt by Allied bombing. now heard stories of American rockets on trucks and endless supplies of casual abundance that mocked their years of sacrifice and hard living. Frau Elisabeth Müller, whose husband was serving in the Wehrmacht, wrote in her diary after getting his last letter. He writes of American rockets, hundreds of them fired from trucks and tanks, as if they cost nothing. Meanwhile, we save every nail, every piece of string. The Americans fight a different war than we do. They fight a rich man's war. The class feeling in that thought was common. The German soldier making do with less and less faced Americans who seemed to have everything. It was not just material unfairness. It was deep and real. The German soldier stood for a nation's desperate struggle. The American soldier stood for an industrial system barely bothered by war. In the prisoner of war camps, German soldiers traded stories that grew with each telling. The rocket tanks became monster weapons in their memories. Truck-mounted systems became whole batteries. The mental trauma turned small weapons into myth, terrible things. An American psychologist, Captain David Rosenberg, studying German prisoners, saw this again and again. They always guessed American rocket vehicle numbers too high by 10 times or more. When shown photos that proved the actual small numbers, they would not believe them. The psychological effect made a false memory stronger than facts. The Germans also could not understand the American attitude to these weapons. German rocket troops were specialists trained for months learning every part of their weapons. American rocket vehicle crews often learned on the job using casual skills that shocked German views. Sergeant Tom Bradley, a Calliope operator, showed this. We had maintenance guys bolt this on our Sherman in about 3 hours. They gave us a quick briefing, basically point and shoot, then said, "Have fun." We figured it out as we went. The Germans we captured could not believe we had maybe 2 days of training on it. Simple training and quick field fixes made it worse. This casual skill, the ability to handle complex weapons without long specialized training, showed American mechanical know-how. A nation of car owners and backyard mechanics could quickly adapt to military machines. The Germans, with their smaller car culture, needed long training for the same tasks. The effect on German morale went beyond the battlefield. Letters home, even heavily censored, showed deep despair. "My dear mother," one soldier wrote, "the Americans are not like us. They do not save ammunition or carefully maintain equipment. They use everything once and throw it away. They fire rockets at single soldiers. They are so rich they can afford to waste. We cannot win against such wealth." Another letter from a junior officer to his wife was even clearer. "I have seen the future, and it is American. They put rockets on trucks. Because they can. They experiment with weapons like children with toys because failure costs them nothing. We are the past, fighting with rules and limits they do not follow." The German High Command tried one last propaganda effort, saying, "American." Rockets were crude, inaccurate, and wasteful. But frontline soldiers knew better. Inaccurate rockets that cover your position were more terrifying than accurate ones that might miss. Feldwebel, Karl Richter, no relation to Ostilhelm. Richter said during interrogation, "You Americans keep saying your rockets are not accurate. But when 60 of them land in my sector in 10 seconds, accuracy does not matter. You made accuracy useless through volume. That is scarier than any precision weapon." The last. German military reports on American rocket vehicles from the final days of the war are clear. They show an army trying to understand how it was beaten by weapons they thought inferior. One report signed by a General Dare Artillery, whose name was later removed, said American rocket artillery shows a new way of war. Instead of perfecting single weapons, they mass-produce good enough systems and get power through numbers. This needs industrial strength. We could never match future German military. Plans must learn this lesson. Of course, there would be no future German military for years, but the lesson was learned by military thinkers worldwide. The American approach, crude, massive, and overwhelming, had proven better than German precision and skill. The Colopy crews often did not know how much fear they caused. They thought of their weapon as awkward and unreliable, that blocked their main gun and made the tank top heavy. Many crewmen wanted normal tank fighting, not rocket work. Private. First Class Joseph Martinez. A Collier loader remembered the truth, not the myth. The Germans thought we were an elite rocket unit, but we were regular tankers stuck with this odd machine. Half the time the rockets did not fire right. The electrical system kept shorting out. We spent more time fixing it than firing it. But the Germans did not know that they heard the rockets and ran. That gap between what they believed and what was true became a weapon. The Germans imagined American technical perfection with endless resources. The reality was makeshift weapons and quick fixes, and that was even more frightening. It showed America could win without much care. The rocket weapons also showed a deep cultural difference. The Wehrmacht from Prussian military tradition looked for perfect weapons and perfect plans. Every operation carefully planned, every soldier fully trained. The Americans brought industrial, practical thinking to war. Good. Enough was fine if you had enough of it. Major Hans Kruger, captured in April 1945, said this clearly: "You Americans have destroyed the art of war. There is no art in what you do. You simply produce and deploy. You made war into factory work. We were soldiers. You are factory bosses in uniforms." His bitter words showed not only military defeat, but cultural collapse. The German military way, built over centuries, was made useless by American industrial methods. The last known German fight with Colopy rockets was on May 4, 1945, 3 days before surrender. A small Wehrmacht unit holding a bridge near Salzburg reported rocket firing tanks coming. The unit commander, a helpman whose name is lost to history, radioed a final message: "Enemy rocket. Tanks in sight. Will not resist. Germany has suffered enough." They surrendered without firing a single shot. The Calliopes they surrendered to were not even loaded. Their crews had run out of rockets days earlier, but the empty tubes were enough. The BC psychological effect worked, even when the physical weapon was gone. Right after the war, German military experts studied the American rocket weapons closely. What they found shocked them. The weapons were even simpler than they had imagined. The rockets were basic, solid fuel devices with simple impact fuses. The mounting systems were welded steel with simple electrical triggers. Any competent metal shop could make them. Dr. Friedrich Hoffmann, no relation to Feld-Webel. Klaus Hoffmann was a German engineer, assigned to evaluate captured American rocket technology. His report was harsh from a technical view. These weapons would fail German quality standards in every way. The welds were rough, the electrical systems basic, the rockets had bad dispersion. Yet they defeated us. We must rethink our entire approach to military technology. This reconsideration would take decades and affect military development worldwide. The lesson of the Colopy was not about rockets, tanks, or trucks. It was about how to produce weapons. The Americans showed that having enough of something could beat having the best of something if the quantity was large enough. Veterans of the rocket attacks carried the psychological scars for years, at a reunion of former Wehrmacht. Soldiers in 1965 talking about American rocket weapons still caused strong reactions. One veteran who faced Calliopes in the Sland refused to watch fireworks because the sound reminded him too much of that screaming barrage. Another veteran, Helmut Wagner, told his grandson years later, "Imagine you trained for years to fence with a sword. You know every move, every counter, every technique. Then your opponent shows up with a machine gun that was fighting American rocket vehicles. They did not defeat our skill. They made our skill useless." The American veterans had their own view. Many were surprised years later to learn about the psychological fear they caused. They saw themselves as ordinary citizens, soldiers making do with whatever tools they had. The idea that they had caused an existential crisis in the Wehrmacht seemed almost unbelievable. Master Sergeant William Cooper, who commanded a Collap in 1945, thought about this years later. "We thought the Germans would laugh at our contraption, rockets strapped to a tank, like some kid's science project. Instead, they were scared, I guess. When you can afford to strap rockets to tanks for fun, that sends a strong message." The message was simple. America had resources. The Germans could not imagine they could experiment, fail waste, and still crush the enemy through sheer production power. The Collapy crude, as it was, became the perfect symbol of this reality. After the war, statistical studies showed the real impact units facing. Rocket-equipped vehicles surrendered 3 times more often than units facing normal weapons. The actual deaths were lower than with conventional artillery, but the psychological effect was total. A U.S. Army study concluded that rocket vehicles achieved strategic effects through tactical use. By breaking German morale at the unit level, they helped cause the fast collapse of German resistance in the last months of the war. The study noted this was not planned. The weapons were made for tactical support, not for causing fear. But whether planned or not, the effect was real. The Wehrmacht, which had stayed together through 5 years of desperate fighting, simply fell apart when faced with American rocket vehicles. Not because the weapons were extremely deadly, but because they showed something the German soldier could not fight: unlimited American industrial power. The last entry in Feldwebel Hoffmann's diary, written in the POW camp. Feldwebel Hoffmann captured it perfectly. They won because they could afford to be wasteful. They could try silly ideas because they had so many resources that even silly ideas could work just by using so much of them. We lost because we could not imagine such wealth. We were defeated by having so much that it became a weapon disguised as rockets on trucks. The Collapy rockets had been the death nail of the Wehrmacht. Not because of what they were, but because of what they showed. The sound of American industry, crude, loud, and unstoppable, could be heard in every explosion. In the end, the Germans could not believe America turned normal trucks into rocket artillery. But that disbelief itself became the weapon that broke their will to fight. The screaming rockets were more than explosives. They were the sound of American factories, unlimited resources, and a style of war that made German military tradition useless. Years after the war, Obus Wilhelm Richter had a final thought about those rocket vehicles. "We had prepared for every contingency, except one. An enemy who did not need to be efficient. The Americans won because they could afford to be wasteful." In war, as in many other things, wealth itself is a strategy.